Welcome back. We're going to discuss this week spying during wartime. We're going to focus on two profoundly impactful wars in the history of early America. We'll concentrate on the American Revolution here, and as you'll see, I actually broke this up into two parts. There'll be a shorter lecture, a separate file that will set up the Civil War. So we will focus here on the American Revolution, American Revolution, and then in a separate lecture, separate recording, we'll touch on the Civil War, just to set that story up, since your reading for this week focuses on the Civil War. So you read much more about that and weigh in on the discussion board. So as we saw last time, surveillance of one's neighbors was commonplace during the colonial era. Ideals of community cohesion and the enforcement of morals were important to them than any notions of privacy. Not that notions of privacy didn't exist, but it took a backseat to different concerns. And as we saw, colonial governments intervened in the most important and intimate parts of human beings' lives: marriage, what goes on in the bedroom, and so on. And as we discussed during our first week, fear, anxiety, threats, and surveillance are all heightened during times of war. The Revolution and Civil War were particularly challenging because the battlefield was Americans' backyard, and war in both instances pitted Americans versus Americans. Even the American Revolution was not just colonists versus the British, but it had elements of Civil War to it, as Americans were pitted against Americans as well. And we are going to talk about that today. Perhaps the most famous American spy of the period is the man pictured there with the noose around his neck. That is Nathan Hale, who we probably learned in grade school, said something like this as he was about to be hanged. He was a spy for the Americans, the colonials, and he was captured by the British. And apparently he said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." So he died a hero. He has been remembered. There's a statue of him in New York. Problem with that story is that Nathan Hale never said that. He never spoke those words. Those words were actually put in his mouth by a friend years after Hale's death. And actually that quote is taken from a play that was popular at the time called Cato. There's Hale's statue in New York. So the real story of Nathan Hale, well, he was from Connecticut, educated at Yale, and when the revolution got going, he was an enthusiastic participant, supporter of the cause, and he joined up to be in the army. And when an opportunity came to serve as a kind of scout, an observer of the British on Long Island and in Brooklyn, he leapt at the opportunity. Unfortunately, he was a terrible spy. He crossed the Long Island Sound from Connecticut, landed in Huntington, and made his way west toward Brooklyn, making observations along the way about troop movements, the movement of supplies, interviewing locals, trying to get information out of them. Now the initial goal of Nathan Hale's excursion was to learn information about the British invasion of New York, of Manhattan. But that happened while he was on Long Island, and Washington abandoned the island. So that changed the nature of Hale's mission. But he pressed on and made his way farther and farther west. He was careless. He would ask locals out in the open, wander around the streets. He may have been spotted by loyalists from Connecticut, where Hale was from, who had fled to New York to find security behind the British lines. He raised the suspicions of a British commander by the name of William Rogers, who entrapped him, who pretended as if he was a supporter of the revolution, asked Hale to dinner with a bunch of other British soldiers in disguise, got Hale to fess up, and Hale was done for. And he was hanged, as most spies were, pretty unceremoniously. Now, one thing his story tells us is that when the spy is working for your side, that spy is a hero. And we remember even invented quotes about them. We build statues to them, write poetry about them. But to the British, he was a no-account spy who deserved a quick death. A witness recorded what, or at least observed what Hale actually said, and he said something about how it was his duty to obey his commander-in-chief and risk his life, and by all accounts, he was composed, did not break down, and took his execution bravely. To show how little respect there was for spying, his body was left hanging for days as a warning to other spies. So spying was a nasty business. And when the American colonists caught wind of what happened to Hale, they would respond in kind when they captured British spies. So spies, once captured, did not go through the same procedures that a captured prisoner of war would, did not have the same trials and proceedings and protections. Rather, just on the command of an officer, that officer can order, yeah, let him swing. And swing they did, on both sides. So this Hale story illustrates a couple of things. One, as I mentioned earlier, a spy for your side is a hero, but a spy for the enemy is the worst of the worst. Second, spying was, and is, of course, a dangerous business in wartime. And spies can be very vulnerable and did not have the protections that other soldiers had. So now let's set up the American Revolution and jump back in time and talk about what brought the revolution into being and why the commander of the colonial's army, George Washington, determined that there was a need for spying. So let's jump back a bit. French and Indian War. You see, this is a couple of decades before, it started a couple of decades before the American Revolution. This was a global war. In Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War. It brought in a number of players: Spain, France, Britain and its colonists. American colonists at this point did not see themselves as separate from Britain. In fact, even once the momentum toward revolution gets going, Americans see themselves as defending their rights as free-born English people at the start, not as Americans, as a separate nation, a separate people yet. It takes some time for that to happen. So this war begins over territorial disputes between the British and French in the in the New World. And so the American colonies mobilize, they cooperate across the borders of those colonies, for the first time in a really concerted way. And you see that poster up in the corner, "Join or Die." You may see this on t-shirts, bumper stickers, and often this is inaccurately associated with the American Revolution, but it's actually a drawing from the French and Indian War, printed by Benjamin Franklin, urging the colonists to work together. And you see the pieces of that snake, there are initials standing for the separate colonies, saying that they should join in the effort to defeat the French in the Americas. Well, glossing over a lot and making a long story short, the outcome of this war is this new map of the Americas. The pink, look at how much more pink there is on the map on the right side of the screen. The outcome of the French and Indian War / 7 Years' War is that France ceases to be a major power in North America, and the British acquire massive new territories. So the reason why I'm concentrating on this for now is that look at all that pink on the map. The British had just won a smashing victory, yes, but an expensive victory. Britain is its debt is deepening, and now it has this vast new territory to populate and defend. So Britain needs money. Where's that money going to come from? It's going to come from the American colonists, and for the first time, British Parliament is going to tax the American colonists directly. So we have a number of new taxes being passed by Parliament. There's the Sugar Act of 1764. You see, this is the year after the French and Indian War. There's a direct correlation between Britain's mounting debt after the victory in the French and Indian War and its need for more revenue. So they put a tax on imported sugar, and in part this tax goes toward enforcement officers in courts that are put in place to end the colonists' illegal trade. Now, the colonists were notorious for defying the mercantile laws that restricted the colony trade with other entities, other nations outside of Great Britain. Now, and Britain had looked the other way for the most part, but now Britain, in desperate need of money, was getting serious about ending the colonists' illegal trade in sugar in this case, and also taxing that product to wrest money out of the colonists. The following year, the Stamp Act was passed. And often this is confused, and some people assume that this is a tax on stamps, but not precisely. The stamp is pictured there. That is an official stamp, and it is almost like a representation of a tax, in that this stamp will have to be purchased alongside things like paper documents, playing dice, playing cards, glassware. And when it's accompanied by this stamp, that shows that it's an official item. So it's an effort to undermine the black market, to show that these are official items, and to show that these have been properly taxed and the proper tax has been paid on them. The response from the colonists was at times violent. There was an uproar among the colonists, and the so-called Stamp Act crisis ensues. In October of 1765, leaders in a number of the colonies, there aren't representatives of every colony there, but most of them are represented in the Stamp Act Congress, and they appeal to the king, King George III. They appeal to the king and Parliament to remove this Stamp Act, to undo it, to end this on a variety of items. And those items, by the way, paper, playing cards, glassware, pretty much every colonist was going to have to pay these taxes because it's essential items. And so the Stamp Act Congress asserts that they cannot and should not be taxed because they have no representation in Parliament. Beyond these more official channels, like the Stamp Act Congress, there's also growing mob violence in the streets. The Sons of Liberty, this patriotic group that emerges in places like New York, in Boston, they organize these violent crowd responses, harassing, tar and feathering, engaging in violence against royal officials, tax collectors, and others. And you see the image there from New Hampshire. This is kind of a carry-on of that tradition we talked about last week, riding Skimmington, of fashioning an effigy of someone and carrying it through the streets as a mark of shame. This is actually one of the kinder responses, these effigies. They would destroy the homes of British officials, tar and feather tax collectors, brutalize them. But it worked. The Stamp Act was repealed in March 1766. But British Parliament, at the same time that it repealed the Stamp Act, also asserted that Parliament does have the right, does have the power to continue to tax the colonists. So the Stamp Act was repealed, but of course the story isn't over. Before we continue that story, I just want to make a point about the Sons of Liberty, and that we see this is not a military group or an official spy organization, but it shows that the colonists are growing accustomed to working in secret, having secret organizations that have secret meetings outside the watchful eyes of British authorities, and together they work to undermine authorities. This kind of work will be required even more in the years ahead. Yes, the Stamp Act had been repealed, but as I said, Parliament asserted that it still had the power to pass such taxes, and it would continue to with the so-called Townshend duties, named after the British finance minister. And so this added taxes on a host of items and necessary items: paper, lead, glass, ink, paints, and tea, probably the most famous taxed item. And there were a couple of goals here. They were paying down their debt, which had been accumulated over many years through several wars, through the building of a navy, through the maintaining and defending of their colonies, not just in the Americas, but in other parts of the globe. But also, the taxes paid from these Townshend duties would also fund new courts that will prosecute violators. So this is sending a message that these taxes, we mean business and we mean to enforce them. There's another point here that's noted on the slide, and I want to highlight this. Townshend duties money would go toward paying the salaries of royal officials in the colonies, which means that now they're being paid directly by Parliament, meaning that colonial governments are not paying them. And so who are these royal officials accountable to? These judges, tax collectors, what have you. They're answerable to who's writing their paycheck, which is Parliament. So there's this growing divide. The Stamp Act victory, such as it was a short-lived one, and more trouble is brewing. The colonists would respond to the Townshend duties, of course, with outrage, just as they had with the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. They continue to assert that Parliament has no right to tax goods to raise money from the colonies. The colonists have no representation on Parliament, and so raising revenue from them is unjust. And they would use this terminology that this is a plot by Parliament, and that was their main villain here. They would come to vilify the king soon enough. But this was a plot to enslave the colonies. And that terminology, yeah, it's not literal in this case, and it is a bit ironic because the colonists themselves, many of them, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, many others, owned slaves. But this is the counterpoint to freedoms that they said they enjoyed as free-born British people. So they maneuver to place economic pressure on the British. Right? The British goal here is to raise money. Britain's in debt, and they're going to have to spend a lot more money maintaining these new lands that they acquired in North America. And so the colonists choose the tack of putting economic pressure, and they refuse to import British goods. Now here is the emergence of a different kind of surveillance, you might say. In order to enforce this non-importation movement that not everyone was on board with, they create non-importation committees, and they put pressure on merchants, consumers, forcing them not to trade British goods, not to purchase British goods, not to use British goods. So they have to monitor one another, identify who is soft on the non-importation movement, who might be more sympathetic to the British, who might be resistant to these growing anti-British sentiments, target those people, and threaten them if they refuse to abide by the non-importation movement. So in this sense, this is kind of one way that the revolution resembles a bit of a civil war, that colonists are pitted against colonists, those who remain loyal to the British and those who are leading the charge against the British. Of course, the story continues. In March 1770, a crowd in Boston begins harassing, throwing objects at a group of British soldiers, and those soldiers then open fire on the crowd, killing several of them. The image there on the slide is actually a print produced by one Paul Revere, probably you've heard, you know of, and this is used as propaganda. It's a little small, the print, but at the top of that image it says "The Bloody Massacre." Now, not many people were killed in this assault, and by the way, the British troops would later be defended by John Adams, one of the founders, who he would go on to be one of the founders, and they would be let off. But nevertheless, lives were lost, and an occurrence like this could be used to stir up anti-British sentiment, and it was. A couple of years later, a bit of calm ensues after the massacre as both sides kind of take a deep breath. In 1772, the first Committee of Correspondence was established. And these are kind of shadow governments that function outside the watchful eye of British authorities. And one particular shadow government, one committee of correspondence, the one in Maryland, would later be in large part responsible for forming the Continental Congress that would prosecute the American Revolution once that begins. Another function of the Committee of Correspondence, besides doing the work of kind of negotiating between colonies, creating a concerted effort, is that they created kind of spy networks. And the work of these spies was to mine royal authorities and also monitor and punish loyalists. Loyalists were the ones who were opposed to revolution, which wasn't in the cards yet. As we know, war is still 3 years away. Declaration of Independence is still 4 years away. But loyalists were those who happily continued to cooperate with the British, trade with them, sympathy for them. These committees of correspondence would keep their eyes, keep watch on them, and punish them from time to time by destroying their property, shaming them in public, or sometimes committing violence against them. And the road to war continues. The Tea Act comes in 1773, and this allows the British to import tea directly to the colonies at a very low price. The idea behind this is that the tea tax was still in effect, but the colonists were boycotting British tea. So the British plan here with the Tea Act was to make British tea so inexpensive that the colonists could not turn it away, and therefore they would agree to taxation without representation simply because they wanted cheap tea. But the colonists were wise to this, and they held a series of so-called tea parties throughout these colonial cities, beginning with Boston on December 16th, 1773. That was the first, but other cities would have them as well, Philadelphia, New York. And here, these kinds of protests were organized in secret. And as you see in this sketch, the Tea Partiers are dressed up like Native Americans. They weren't Native Americans, they were disguises. And they hop aboard these ships carrying British tea. In fact, as the ships are making their way into Boston Harbor, there are some 5,000 Bostonians waiting to catch a glimpse of the tea party that's to come, and they toss hundreds of boxes overboard. Now, Parliament and the King were not going to put up with this kind of outright resistance, destruction of property. And so, what comes next? The Coercive Acts of 1774. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, saying that these are intolerable, especially coming on the heels of Sugar Acts and Stamp Acts and Townsend Duties and Tea Acts. These coercive acts were meant specifically to punish the colonists. To punish Boston, the royal authorities close Boston Harbor, and they suspend elections and governments within Massachusetts. This is specifically targeting Boston and the Massachusetts colony, punishing them for their role in these tea parties and their leading role in resistance to British rule. They also pass a new quartering act. There had been an earlier quartering act which allowed British troops to be housed in institutions like hotels, inns, and so on. This quartering act legalized the housing of British soldiers in public and private dwellings at the colonists' expense. So if a contingent of British troops knocks on someone's door, the The colonists had no recourse. They had to put them up, had to house them, had to quarter them. There was another of these coercive acts that actually didn't apply to the 13 colonies that would later become the first 13 states of the United States of America. This Quebec Act, through this Quebec Act, the British built a permanent government in their colony of Quebec that they had acquired from the French in the French and Indian War. And they set up an authoritarian government, one in which there are no elections, there is no representation, and the king has complete say. Rule authority is unquestioned. So why would this go in the category of an intolerable act? It didn't even apply to Massachusetts, to Georgia, and the other colonies that are stirring up anti-British sentiment on their way to revolution. Well, this Quebec Act was kind of a threat from the British, saying, well, we're doing this to Quebec, excuse me. You could be next. So in response to the intolerable acts, the First Continental Congress, stemming from those committees of correspondence, is formed September, October 1774. It thoroughly rejects the intolerable acts. Right, that's what intolerable means. They can't tolerate them. At this point, I want to emphasize that this Continental Congress does acknowledge the authority of Parliament and the King. They still consider themselves subjects. They still consider themselves British. Now, there is some sentiment toward independence, but it's not as widespread as it will be in the next 2 years. And they begin to even more use the language of natural rights of all men, not just laws written down by people, not laws written in black and white constitutions, legal codes, but also natural rights that all people are born with. And of course, these would find expression in the Declaration of Independence, which we'll look at in just a sec. They restate their opposition to parliamentary taxes and the forced payment of those taxes. And they also send word to the other colonies, and many of them would follow this advice, begin to organize their own militias, calling up people to grab their muskets and rifles and be prepared to fight, and also organize their own courts. Now here the goal is to suppress dissent against this anti-British movement and to put a lid on loyalism. Or these were the people who remained loyal to Britain. So this requires a healthy dose of monitoring neighbors. Who looks like a loyalist? Who is having British generals over to dinner? Which one of these merchants is not agreeing to the importation plan, non-importation plan? So they're watching one another, and potentially these loyalists could be tried for their loyalism. The Congress forms continental associations to do some of this work of monitoring loyalists and enforcing this boycott. These committees of safety, which are extensions of the Continental Association, would be out in the towns, keeping their eyes on townsfolk, on merchants, on farmers, making sure that they're abiding by the boycott. And if not, they could be ratted on, they could be punished in some way. The Continental Association also organizes the ending of exports to Britain. So they're already banning the importation of British goods. And we saw what happened when they tried to bring in British tea. But also, they're also saying no more American goods for Britain. So they're putting this devastating economic pressure on Britain, which of course this all started because Britain needed cash. War, of course, is coming. In April 1775, British troops begin marching on Lexington in Massachusetts. There was an armory there, a cache of weapons, and the British troops were on their way there to seize that armory to prevent the colonists from using it. But they were by a small group of colonists, only about 70, not a large group. And those colonists, Minutemen, they would be called because they would have to organize in a minute. They engaged with the British but quickly retreated. Many of them the survivors made their way to Concord, where there was a much larger force of Americans waiting for them. And they would fight back against the British, and the British would retreat. The Battle of Boston would ensue. But beyond those details, these are the first shots fired of what becomes the War for Independence. It's not yet a war for independence, but it will be soon enough. Now, how did the colonists know that the British were on their way to Lexington? Well, thanks to the word sent by Paul Revere, a Bostonian. You can visit his house in Boston today. It's an historic site. Revere himself, a patriot, he was a member of a committee of safety. He was one of the Sons of Liberty, and his job in this case was to keep his eye on British forces and send advance word if they were on their way. And so, as part of this code, this message that he would send, he would climb up to the top of Old North Church in Boston, put one lantern if the British were coming by land, and two if they were coming by sea. And so he did that and then proceeded through the countryside on horseback, sending warnings that the British are on their way. So now there's a war. This isn't just boycotts and bans. Now this is a war, and the war has to be given meaning, and the war has to be fought successfully so that the colonists achieve their aims. So the Second Continental Congress is organized in May 1775. And they create here the Continental Army, a military force that combines troops from all the colonies, all 13 colonies, led, of course, by General George Washington. So there was this organized force, and there was also militias, which had shorter terms, usually served closer to home. This Continental Congress would serve as a sort of national government. Technically, it's not a legal government. It's because the British haven't recognized it. This is treason that these colonists are committing. This is the government that they form to oversee the war effort and to make sure that the colonies cooperate. This was a challenge not only because they were facing a large, powerful, menacing foe in the British, but also because the colonists themselves were divided. So I mentioned loyalists before, also referred to as Tories. When it came to choosing sides, the majority of colonists were in sympathy with this anti-British movement, even if at first they may not have been revolutionaries, may not have been in favor of independence right away. The majority were opposed to those taxes, were opposed to the measures being taken by Parliament and the King. But about 20% of the colonial population, some 500,000 of them, fell into the category of loyalists. And on the one hand, many of these loyalists were among the richest in society, rich merchants who made their fortunes trading with the British. But there was also an appeal for tenant farmers, for slaves, and for Indians. Tenant farmers, people who were struggling in the colonies, may find greater opportunities in the British Army, or will take up the British on offers of land. Slaves were drawn to loyalism, drawn to the British side, not 100%, but many were, because Britain offered emancipation, freedom to slaves who fled their masters and joined the British. And Native Americans, many of these groups had very tense relations with the colonists. Some, right, in the French-Indian War we talked about earlier, of course, some were on the side of the French. And they actually felt that the British, the Crown, had tried to protect them against the colonists. Regardless of who these loyalists were, they would be targeted by the Patriots. The Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, would ban anti-revolutionary speech at the risk of being locked up. Bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is a warrant for someone's arrest without a statement of cause, without a charge. So a warrant could just have a name, someone's name on it, and not say what they've done, not say what they're being charged with, not say who the witnesses are, not say who's making the charge. Someone suspected of being a loyalist, they could be arrested based on these bills of attainder. And of course, outside these more official efforts, there is, of course, the ever-present mob violence to put pressure on these loyalists to switch sides or at least shut up. Many can't handle the pressure and flee. Some make their way behind British lines. Some find their way to Canada. Slaves would escape, find passage to Africa or to the West Indies. So, in part, this revolution is a story of colonist against colonist. Of course, ultimately, this would become a war for independence. And those statements of natural rights, that belief in natural rights, would find expression in the Declaration of Independence, which starts as a long list of grievances against the king. And of course states these unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and asserts that in instances when a government fails to uphold those rights, the people have a right to rebel and to form their own governments. Now, of course, successfully winning independence, in this case, will require winning a war. And unfortunately for the American colonists, in the wake of the Declaration of Independence, a lot of bad news would trickle in from the battlefields. One thing that the commander of the Continental Army, George Washington, would realize is that in order to gain an edge on the British, who had strength in numbers, strength and equipment. For the colonists, they were defending their home turf. And Washington realized, even though there wasn't a long and noble tradition of spying and intelligence work, that intelligence work, surveillance, would be key in giving the colonists an edge. This is an excerpt from a letter Washington wrote to General William Heath, September 1st, 1776. Much will depend on early intelligence and meeting the enemy before they can entrench. In other words, know the enemy's movements before they can actually move. I should much approve of small harassing parties, these small advanced groups of scouts to kind of engage the British enemy in small skirmishes, to distract them, to steal from their base of supplies. Parties stealing over in the night, as they might keep the enemy alarmed, more than probably bring off a prisoner from whom some valuable intelligence may be obtained. That was one of Washington's early frustrations. He was frustrated with, in some instances, with the quality of his fighting force, especially the militia, and their lack of discipline, but also with the lack of good information about the movements of the British. So one of the first efforts toward those ends of finding better intelligence, we see the formation of so-called Knowlton's Rangers, formed in August 1776. This is the first organized reconnaissance group, made up of New England men, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut. Nathan Hale was a member of these Knowlton's Rangers. Hale we, of course, spoke of earlier. They got their name, this is their nickname, because their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton, who would actually be killed in combat, the Battle of Harlem Heights, not long after Washington wrote that letter that I just quoted. The Battle of Harlem Heights was one in a series of defeats that the Americans suffered at the hands of the British as the Americans were on their way to abandoning Manhattan and Long Island. What these Rangers mainly were scouts in search of military intelligence, troop movements, locations of supplies. There wasn't formal spy training. So there was a lot of improvisation and making it up as they go. And many of these spies were caught and summarily hanged, as Hale was. Well, the information that the Rangers provide is not enough to stave off the series of defeats that the Americans suffer in the New York-New Jersey campaign from summer into fall of 1776. In the wake of these campaigns, the British occupy Manhattan, Long Island, and parts of New Jersey. Only with the intervention of nature, a cloudy, misty night that allowed Washington's forces to escape, were they able to survive and fight another day. So things are not looking good on the battlefield. Intelligence is a shambles. The British occupy Manhattan with its many natural advantages, its harbors, its strategic location at the bottom of the Hudson River. And that spy network, such as it was, is not functioning as Washington would like it to. There's Hale again, as I mentioned. He was one of Knowlton's Rangers. He was apprehended in his rather inept attempts at spying. And this is an entry from a British logbook on his execution. A spy from the enemy, by his own full confession, apprehended last night, was this day executed at 11 o'clock in front of the artillery park. No poetry in that, It's just recording. Yeah, we caught this guy. We killed the bastard. No heroism in that when described by the enemy. So as I said earlier, captured spies of the enemy are shameful creatures and often executed quickly. And so Washington and others in his force come to the realization that it's necessary not to just send people around like Hale was, wandering the streets, talking to people, or going up into trees looking at the movement of troops and supplies, but he sees the necessity of, in his words, engaging some of those people who have obtained protections to go in under pretense of asking advice. What this means is have people embedded among the British, who the British will think are on their side, are sympathetic to them, are allies, but are actually secretly sending information back to Washington. So he obtains the services of Nathaniel Sackett, Benjamin Talmadge. Talmadge we will talk quite a bit about, and Major John Clark begin to establish what they call secret services on Long Island. Instead of simple scouting, they sent agents into enemy territory to act as spies, to gather information for Washington, but also feed false information to the British, to deceive the British so that they don't quite know what the colonists are up to. Now, Sackett would lose his position under mysterious circumstances. And this, I guess, shows the difficulties in forming and maintaining a spy network. Here is Sackett's summary of what happened and what would lead to his ouster from this spy network. And it's quite cryptic, strange, and we're not clear quite what happened, but here's Sackett's summary of events. Quote, I'd gone through all those dangers that awaited me and getting a regular plan laid, and was beginning to carry it on with every appearance of success. But the Jersey man fell in love with his horse, the doctor narrowly escaped with his wife, and the whole scheme was frustrated. I don't know what the hell he just described, but apparently there was some guy in New Jersey he was relying on who fell in love with his horse, and that upset his scheme. Horse love. So in the absence of Sackett, Talmadge, who would take on the code name of John Bolton, he was appointed head of the Continental Army's Secret Service in October 1778, and he would actually build an effective spy network, which would become known as the famous Culper spy ring. And there are signs all over Long Island, in Setauket, Oyster Bay, and other places with markers of people involved in this spy ring. And there is a television show called Turn, inspired by, it's highly fictionalized, but inspired by this spy network. So Talmadge recruits his friend Abraham Woodhull, who would take on the code name of Samuel Culper in his secret correspondence. That's how the Culper spy ring gets its name. And Caleb Brewster and neighbor Anna Smith Strong would all be involved in this spy ring on Long Island. So they would gather information as frequently as possible. Woodhull or Culper would find his way into Manhattan. He had family there. Gather information while there. Record that information. You'd use a secret code or visible ink that will only show up when the paper is treated. Pass those messages onto Brewster, then to Talmadge, and then to Washington. Brewster would take the message across the Long Island Sound. Now, Culper, or Woodhull, his activities would arouse some suspicion, and he was questioned. And so he realized other people in this group he needed further support. So he recruited Robert Townsend, who would go by the name Samuel Culper Jr., he of Oyster Bay, a man by the name of Austin Rowe, and a mystery woman who has never been identified. So this map tracks the the movement of this information. As you see over in New York City, it says Robert Townsend would move around New York, gathering information on British troop movements and ships. He would pass that information on to Austin Rowe, who owned a tavern in Setauket. Rowe, who would go to the city to gather supplies and collect these messages. Give that information to Caleb Brewster, who would take it across the Sound, where Talmadge would collect it up in Connecticut and pass it along to George Washington. As you see there, Anna Smith Strong, she was a neighbor of Woodhull, also known as Samuel Culper. She would hang her wand up to indicate where Woodhull should meet Caleb Brewster for this secret exchange of information. Here's one of the codes that they used. It was a simple substitution code where a series of numbers would mean a particular word, and whoever was collecting information would have the code breaking. 219 would mean gun, 451 would mean occupy, 252 Hill, 711 George Washington, 499 pervert. Now I put that there because you might think, oh, they're talking about perverts, but no, they're not talking about perverts. The verb to pervert, to mess up something. The Culper ring would be responsible for unearthing some major British schemes. In fact, it was thanks to the work of the Culper ring, including that mystery woman who I mentioned earlier has not been identified. They uncovered the scheming of the American Major General Benedict Arnold, who of course has gone down in history as a traitor to America. That is a shorthand for somebody who's a traitor. They were referred to as a Benedict Arnold. Well, he had a plan because he felt that he was owed money by the Continental Congress. In fact, he was owed money and was deep in debt. And so he made an agreement with the British that in exchange for money, he would help them capture West Point. And he promised to do so while George Washington and several officers were there. Now it seems as if the first rumblings of this were heard by this mystery woman through her friendship with British Major General John Andre. Correspondence between Andre and Arnold were captured. Letters were intercepted by the Culper ring. And then Andre, on his way to deliver messages to Benedict Arnold, coded messages and maps, was captured. And remember what they do to spies. Andre was captured and hanged just as Nathan Hale and other captured spies were. So the spy network was effective. It worked. And it is unusually effective, perhaps unexpectedly effective, because Washington and the Americans had little experience with these methods, but they were finding a way to be successful. Now, this kind of spying, of course, is much different from the other kinds of spying that we've talked about already. Mass collection of emails, mass collection of phone information. Of course, that kind of stuff was not possible back. And here they're actually targeting enemy combatants, people who are actively seeking to undermine them. This is a little more, the morals of this are a bit more clear cut. And this is not like the Puritans and the Virginians, as we talked last week, monitoring people's sex lives. This is effective spy work in a military campaign. Also active in the spy network were a pair of men, a name of Hercules Mulligan and Cato. Hercules Mulligan was a tailor in New York City. He had previously, before the war, had housed Alexander Hamilton, remained a friend of Hamilton's. Mulligan, as a tailor, had access to higher-ups in the British military, and so as he was measuring them for uniforms and clothing, they would confide in him from time to time. And Mulligan would pass this information along, in some instances, to his slave, a man by the name of Cato. And sometimes they would work through the culper ring to pass that information along to George Washington, or other times Cato would bring the message directly. Now, here's a strange case of Cato, being a slave, had more freedom to move because he was under less suspicion. He was derided, looked down upon. But they would also work through the culper ring. And in at least two instances, information gathered by Mulligan and Cato warned Washington of two British ambushes. One involving a meeting between Washington and the French at Newport, Rhode Island. Mulligan caught wind of this and spread that word. That made its way to Washington, and that meeting was rearranged, relocated. Now that image, there's no image I could find of Mulligan and Cato online, and so that is the actor who plays Hercules Mulligan in the musical Hamilton. Had been born in Ireland, looks nothing like this man, but that's one of the attractive qualities of the Hamilton musical, is that it recast history, making it more contemporary. The war, of course, would come to an end, and one of the climactic battles would take place in 1781 at Yorktown in Virginia, which French and American forces together lay siege to a British fort, and the British commander and his men surrender. There's more fighting over the next couple of years, but the war would finally be settled by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. It's in this treaty that the British recognize American independence. And because of the secrecy of spying networks that we talked about, a lot of that information only recently came to light. Some of it we only learned within the last 50 years or so. But certainly the role of spies in this military campaign was a critical one. Of course, without independence, then this new nation couldn't be founded. Constitution could not be written. In September 1787, with their second attempt at forming a government, they had already formed the Articles of Confederation, but were doing away with those articles in favor of a constitution. It's approved at convention in September 1787. And by 1788, 9 states had ratified that constitution, had approved it, but only gained that requisite support because a Bill of Rights was promised. And of course, there's that Bill of Rights that we talked about our first week, and that is the basis for our sense of what it means to enjoy a right to have protection of individual liberties, even protections shielding us from the power of our own government. And this makes sense in the context of our understanding of the American Revolution. They had experience with an overbearing, aggressive, tyrannical government, and these Bill of Rights are meant to protect the American people from that possibility. The extent to which they've succeeded, of course, that's up to the determination of all of us. And that's, as we saw our first week, that is an ongoing discussion. To what extent are we living up to the values stated in these Bill of Rights? So that is the American Revolution and the role of spies in it. In addition to that military role that the Culper Ring played, we also saw how the Sons of Liberty, committees of safety, and other groups at a more local level would keep watch on British authorities, would keep watch on loyalists, put pressure on them, inform on them. So keeping tabs on one another was very much part of this effort, of this war effort. So we've talked about the revolution. In part 2, we're going to discuss briefly the build-up to the Civil War, the outbreak of Civil War, to set up that discussion, which you will engage in on discussion board and read about. So more to come. Thanks.